Russia to cease reckless action, the words of the US Secretary of State this morning during his visit to Ukraine. Antony Blinken is there to offer a show of support after Russia amassed troops near the country's eastern border earlier this year. Well, joining me to discuss this live from Washington, D.C. is Matthew Rojansky, who is director of the Wilson Center's Kennedy Institute, and the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Ambassador John Herbst. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Ambassador Herbst, what do you see as the main purpose of the new administration's policy towards Ukraine? What's Mr. Blinken hoping to achieve?
Well, I think the first matter is what you've already mentioned, which is that we saw a Russian military buildup on Ukraine's eastern border and in northern Crimea. And we saw also a Russian military buildup in the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. And Mr. Blinken is there to tell first Ukraine, but then Moscow, that the United States stands strongly with Ukraine as it faces this Russian campaign of pressure. The second thing, of course, is the United States is deeply interested in helping Ukraine promote reform. And Mr. Blinken is there to express some concern about changes made last week in the Ukrainian gas company Naftogaz, and also to encourage Ukraine to proceed with court reform.
And Dr. Rojansky, one could say, that he's succeeded even before he got to Kiev because the Russians have withdrawn that military buildup on the eastern border, or would that be going too far?
No, Adam, I think it's correct that the administration has not been waiting for this visit or any message delivered in this visit to serve as the fulcrum of the policy. If you look back several weeks already, President Biden, who's conducted 2 phone calls with President Putin, both times has warned about threats to Ukraine's sovereignty. He has put the interest in a potential summit meeting out there, quite frankly, I think as a bargaining chip. That summit meeting could always be canceled or withdrawn. And I do think the Russians want to have that summit, as does the United States. And that's an incentive not to escalate. There have been phone calls between the top military officials and national security officials on both sides. But also President Biden has reached out directly to President Zelensky. He's been crystal clear in his direct statements to Zelensky and in statements issued by the White House about supporting Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. So that all sets the table for this visit by Secretary Blinken, in which those messages will all be reinforced. But, Secretary Blinken himself, I think, is cognizant. If you look at the tweets and the statements by the State Department spokesperson, this is a very symbolic visit, right? This is about the images that we're looking at now about the United States standing with Ukraine. But the policy has been there all along, and I think it remains quite consistent.
Ambassador, if the West wanted to reinforce Ukraine against the threat from Russia, wouldn't the best way to do it to be to do what we've refused to do so far, which is to allow Ukraine to join NATO or indeed to join the European Union?
Well, those are steps that can be taken, but as I think you know, there's not quite agreement either within the EU or within NATO for Ukraine to move closely towards membership. But there are other things that can and have been done. For example, to let Moscow know there'll be additional sanctions if they escalate their aggression against Ukraine, to provide more military support for Ukraine. And as I think you know, British destroyers are entering the Black Sea to also demonstrate concern.
And what do you think, Mr. Rojansky, of concrete gestures which Western nations, Western allies could make to bolster Ukraine?
Well, I agree very much with John. I think there have been plenty of such gestures. What we've seen over the last 6 or 7 years is a gradual increase in readiness by the Ukrainian side to accept the kind of assistance that will make a difference in reinforcing its sovereignty. One side of that ledger is, of course, military assistance. We have a training mission that involves American soldiers, UK soldiers, Canadians, and others. It's actually on the territory of Ukraine. That's incredibly symbolic. We have direct military assistance, lethal and non-lethal, financial assistance, and expertise within the ministries in Ukraine, including the Ministry of Defense. All of that is very important in terms of retooling what, at the time of Russia's invasion in 2014, was a very ineffective military, a very post-Soviet military that was hampered by corruption. But corruption is the other side of the ledger, and that speaks to Ukraine's challenges more broadly. I know that these will be on the agenda in Secretary Blinken's visit. They have been on the agenda all along. Ukraine cannot effectively defend its sovereignty against external threats when it faces this incredible internal threat of degeneration and backsliding towards corruption. Now, there have been positive steps. I don't want to ignore those. But as John mentions, there's recent cause for concern. And I think that the pace of progress has long been a concern as we see kind of politics and this problem of oligarchic influence and oligarchic interests eroding the pace of reform. I think that's going to be very much on the table for this discussion.
And Ambassador, how well do you think that the president is doing in Ukraine? After all, he was a comic actor playing a president before he was elected. How's he been as a leader?
Learning curve on Zelensky's side. For example, on the security issue, during his first 15, 16, 18 months in office, he offered a variety of concessions or compromises to the Kremlin out of, I would say, a somewhat naive expectation that this would produce a result of stepping towards peace. And those compromises were controversial in Ukraine, and often Mr. Zelensky had to step back. And so we've seen, I think, a certain growth as he's dealt with the national security issues as president of Ukraine. On the reform side, it's a little bit of a reverse. He had a very strong start promoting a reform agenda. And then in March of 2020, he removed a reform candidate, and reform has kind of stumbled since. But I believe now with an activist U.S. administration, exemplified by Mr. Blinken in Kyiv, we will see further efforts by Mr. Zelensky to push a reform agenda in Ukraine, in partnership with the United States, the EU, the IMF, and so on.
Thank you both very much indeed.